Good evening, YouTube and Facebook.
Good evening, YouTube and Facebook.
Are you playing music?
Oh, I didn't share my screen. I didn't share my music. Oh,
Yes.
here we go. There we go. There we go.
Hey.
That works. Gotta let it go for a little while.
Good evening, everyone. We're still coming into the room here this evening. Seeing some new names, some new faces. Welcome. Welcome to VBC Happy Hour for Monday, September 4th. My name is Sean Hall. I'm Director of Programming with the VBC. Our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing this for 15 years. It's our 15th birthday. And with me, as always, is Executive Director Todd DiPastino. Todd, how you doing?
Happy Labor Day, everybody. I'm doing well.
Good. We also, you might look around the room and see another Todd DiPastino, an impersonator.
He's an impersonator.
Larry's doing his best. It's not Halloween yet, but I want the real Todd to grow a beard like Larry's. I think that would be exciting.
I cannot grow a beard. I cannot grow a beard.
Me either. I can only do scruff. But
okay.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy that you're joining us. We have a great show planned for you this evening. Several announcements to start the evening off with, and then we'll be getting to two gentlemen, two Korean War veterans. Narce Caliva. Narce, how do you get off having the coolest name of anybody we've had join us? That is a great name. Right. And Jack, you're here as well. You could both on the same screen. You want to give me a wave just so we can see? And that's Narce waving. And Jack, as you look at the screen, Jack is on the left. We'll be getting both their stories very shortly. But first, we want to go ahead and thank our wonderful sponsor, as always, Tobacco-Free Adagio Health. They've been with us for quite a long time, and they are dedicated to reducing and preventing tobacco use and to getting the word out about the hazards of smoking and secondhand smoke. They're all about health, so they want people to quit. They have classes, nicotine replacement therapy, and a popular quit line, 1-800-QUIT-NOW. They also educate people, children, especially about tobacco use from cigars, cigarettes, pipes, chew, snuff, and other nicotine products like vaping. And finally, Tobacco-Free Adagio Health advocates for public and private policies that ensure healthy places to live, work, and play. You can learn all there is to know about Tobacco-Free Adagio Health on their website, tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org, or you can give them a call on the quit line. Thank you so much for supporting the VBC and our mission. We also have a wonderful magazine. For those of you who may be joining us new and you're just finding out about VBC, you jumped into the Zoom room, welcome for one, but two, we have a great magazine. We love to tell everybody about it. It's free. We give it away quarterly. We mail it to you. All you have to do is send us your address, and you can do so by either emailing myself or Todd, and it's very easy. It's my name, Sean, S-H-A-U-N, at veteransbreakfastclub.org, or Todd, T-O-D-D, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. It is a fantastic magazine. I have my copy right here, along with all of the other books that we are going to be bringing authors on to talk about. My desk is cluttered with them, but I also have a clutter of these wonderful magazines. Make sure you email us your address, and we would love to get the magazine out to you. It's the best way for us to get the word out about VBC and all the wonderful programs that we have on offer. Lioness, the Origin Story. This is a podcast. We're doing a mini-series podcast based on the Army Lioness soldiers. These were women who went over in 2003 into Iraq. They were going over as engineers. They ended up having to go outside the wire because men can't frisk and search women and children. So these women went outside the wire and they were asked to help. And they ended up gathering tons of information because they'd start talking to the women. But they also got into combat. This was before the combat exclusion policy was done away with. So they were dubbed the Lioness Team. This is a really popular podcast. We're about 5 episodes deep. We're planning at least 3, maybe 4 more. We're going from the Lioness story to the Marine FET teams, the female engagement teams, and on to the cultural support teams. This is an evolving podcast. We're having on many special guests to talk about this very interesting history and background. And I'm gonna tip our cap and pat ourselves on the back a little bit. We're the only ones doing it across the country. We're talking about a very select small piece of the military that happened in the last 15 to 20 years. And I hope that you can give this a listen whenever you get a chance. It's quite fascinating, and I'm very proud to be a part of it. Todd, you have a talk coming up this week.
I do have a talk coming up, and I'm just looking in the chat. Melissa can't hear us. So if anybody has a Melissa Loises can't hear us and should like to, she could see us. If anybody has a suggestion for Melissa, you could put it in the chat. But I'm gonna be talking about Vietnam. I'm a historian, as many of you know, not a veteran, but somebody who taught for many years a course on the history of Vietnam and the Vietnam War. And I thought, in advance of our trip to Vietnam, which we're leaving on November 27th, I'll give a 5-part series on a kind of a quirky history and a lecture series on the history and culture of Vietnam. So join us Thursday night. The first one will be Thursday night. It's not part of our usual schedule, at 7 p.m. at this Zoom channel. And I'll talk for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll just have conversation about the fascinating history and culture of this intriguing country that we're going to be visiting shortly.
Todd, despite how long I've known you, I don't know if I've ever asked why you had an interest in Vietnam.
Well, the Vietnam War. That's like many Americans of my age who came of age in the 1970s, early 1980s. Vietnam was this lingering shadow over the whole nation and over my understanding of our nation's history. And so, like most Americans, I understood Vietnam as a war first, not as a country. But when I visited Vietnam for the first time in 2018, I really felt like I was getting to know it as a place apart from the war. And in fact, in the long history of Vietnam, the American War is really a blip in the 2,000-year history. So it's one of those subjects that the more you dig into, the more you learn and the more fascinated you become.
Definitely join us September 7th, 7 p.m. here on this Zoom channel for that discussion. We also have an in-person breakfast coming up this Friday at Beulah Presbyterian Church over there in Penn Hills, which is sort of on the east end of Pittsburgh. For those of you maybe joining us here in the Zoom room that are not from Pittsburgh, we do these in-person breakfasts all around the Pittsburgh region. It is sort of our namesake. We started as a breakfast club. Many people say, why would you breakfast club when you don't do breakfast? Well, this is it. This is the marquee. Come and check out our in-person breakfast. It's pretty much us putting on a wonderful program of veteran stories, veterans sharing, and we get to eat, we get to chat. It's how I got involved in the VBC and what kept me coming back. I love the program. So if you have a chance to visit us in Penn Hills, please do. We have many more in-person breakfasts coming up throughout the rest of the year. And guess what? They are all listed in our magazine. I'm linking it back. Next up, we have our 688. Todd, we have a screening. We've done this once before, but it was quite a long time ago for those of you who've been with us for a while. But it's kind of a big deal that we're going to play it again.
Yes, Elizabeth Helm Fraser succeeded in getting September 16th proclaimed or named National 6888 Day. And the 6888th Postal Battalion was the only unit of Black women to serve overseas during World War II. And they did one heck of a job sorting through the mail. There was a backlog of millions of pieces of mail that had to be delivered to service members in Europe. And they managed to do it. And it's their story of what it was like to serve in a segregated military, what it was like as a woman to serve in the Army, what it was like to go overseas, and of course, tackle this mountain of mail. So there's a wonderful documentary made about the 6888. It will soon be turned into a major Netflix series or maybe a movie on Netflix. But before that, we're going to screen it here on September 16th and talk to the filmmaker and talk to Elizabeth Helm Fraser also about her Army veteran. She's an Army veteran, about her efforts to remember the 6888.
And also before that, next Monday, I failed to put that into our slide deck, is that next Monday, September 11th. So we will be on that night. We're going to have open conversation that night. Open it up to the room. We're going to, remember 9/11, remember where we were and what it meant to all of us. Please join us next Monday, 7 p.m. in this Zoom room as we discuss and talk about and honor September 11th. And then final is in a couple of weeks, September 18th, we will have the VA Undersecretary Joshua Jacobs on to talk about the PACT Act, and other bits of business. Todd, what else would he be
Yeah,
discussing?
he's going to brief us on what's going on in veterans benefits with the VA. Obviously, the PAC Act will take up, I think, a lot of his remarks, and then he's going to take questions. And we'll be fielding questions for him, I think, probably through the chat, and have him answer it. So it took a while to get the Undersecretary of the VA on the program, but we managed to get him scheduled for September 18th, and I hope you join us.
All right. And we'll be getting to the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Gatling that Jack served on shortly and soon. But before we do that, before we get to Narce and Jack, there is a somber announcement. Todd, I wanted to hand it off to you and Greg.
Yeah, we had one of our veterans, Lou Nudie. I just learned today from his friend Greg Yost, who attends our programs here online. Lou Nudie passed away, and we will miss him greatly. He was 84 years old. He was an Army captain, served in Vietnam. He was an advisor, and he came on our program, one of our programs that we did on Vietnam advisors. He advised in the Mekong Delta, and Lou is also one of our companions in our 2018 trip to Vietnam. And in fact, he appears on the cover here of our winter, our magazine, the winter edition of our VBC magazine, which came out in January. Here is Lou at the DMZ. And it was very much a healing trip for Lou. It was really, it was really wonderful to get to know him and to kind of see him evolve and heal over the course of the 2 weeks that we were in Vietnam. Lou is also one of the veterans featured in the documentary that was made about that trip called We Left His Brothers. You can see Lou is here on one of the covers of We Left His Brothers. I was, excited to announce to everybody that we have We Left His Brothers, the Veterans Breakfast Club documentary, is now available on Blu-ray and also streaming on Amazon. But it's a note kind of now tinged with sadness that we lost Lou. So I don't know if Greg Yost is with us tonight. If he is, I'll invite him to share anything he might want to say. He might not be with us tonight.
I thought I saw him enter the room earlier. Greg Yost there. I'll ask Greg to unmute.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, it was very sad. He was 84, which is one of those things where, you appreciate that you make it to 84, but then you start to wish for another 8 or 4. But,
yeah,
life does what it does. And of course, he survived Vietnam, survived Tet, as many people on this program have done. And I think he appreciated what he had after that. I know he appreciated greatly the trip back. And he did feel that he gained a lot from that, including a sense that maybe he and the U.S. had accomplished something, because he felt that when he was in the North, when you guys were in the North, he saw a lot of what he saw in Vietnam when he was there 50 years ago. Yeah. When he went south, he didn't recognize the place. Yeah. The whole place was changed. He didn't recognize Saigon. He didn't recognize the town he was in. And first words out of his mouth when he came back that I heard him say were, who lost that war? The North. And Todd, I know on Thursday you're going to be discussing the great cultural differences, and Vietnam is not one place. There are historically cultural differences between North and South and other regions, et cetera. But I find that I found that very helpful to hear, because I think that people thought that Vietnam was not accomplishing anything, and maybe in the end, it accomplished something. The services are not yet complete, but I think there's going to be some viewings later this week and a mass on Friday. So I'll try to email that to you, Todd, if you want to put it out to anyone. It will certainly be in the newspapers, et cetera. So may he rest in peace. I thank God for his 84 years here, and I think a lot of us here do as well.
Thank you, Greg. Yeah, we will definitely miss Lou, and please do keep us posted about any kind of arrangements or memorial. That trip to Vietnam was phenomenal. We went again in 2020 with another group, and we're going again this year. And if anybody wants to join us, let me know fast, because there are 20 of us going, and it's about at the deadline. Sean, I want to get to Jack and Narce, but do you mind? I'm sorry, I didn't tell you about this, but I noticed that Tammy Datry is with us this evening here, and Tammy just contacted me today because her father served in Korea, Army, at a medevac station there. Like so many of you veterans, he didn't talk about it much with his family. His own daughter didn't really know much about his service. He saved very little of his time in the Army, but toward the end of his life, and he died just a few years ago, I think it became clear to Tammy how much his Army service meant to him, and how much his time in Korea meant to him. And Tammy emailed and asked me, she said, among my father's few things is this flag, a pennant, a guidon or something that he seemed to cherish and folded and kept. The flag is on the left. And she said, do you have any idea what it might be? And I don't have any idea. It looks kind of like a naval, international signal flag. Narce Keep here, or I'm sorry, Jack Keep here, Navy veteran, said, yeah, this is the right colors, but it's not any kind of flag that I'd recognize. This is kind of what it's closest to, which is the Z flag or Zulu flag, which is, I think, a flag, a Navy flag of distress, maybe. I'm dead in the water. I need to be tugged out. But if anybody might have an idea about what this flag might be, and again, it looks like maybe a unit guidon or something like that, just put it in the chat or raise your hand and maybe we can get some answers for Tammy. Oh, Don Nemchek. Here we go. Tammy, I hope you're listening.
I certainly am.
Oh, good. Hi, Tammy. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
Did I state it correctly about your dad's service?
You did great. Yes.
Okay. Don, what do you think?
Todd, I'm just guessing on this, but if that second flag is the Zulu flag, that first flag may be the Bravo flag. A signalman will have flags, of course, that might be the letter B for Bravo Zulu, which is a nautical term to say, good job, thank you. I didn't look it up any further, but if that's the Zulu flag on the right, that might be the Bravo flag on the left, meaning if you hoist that up, Bravo Zulu, that means you're thanking the ship across the ocean from you by signal flags. They did a good job, or thank you. I'm guessing now, but I think that might be a reasonable guess.
Tammy, would your Army veteran father have stolen a flag from the Navy? Was he that kind of guy?
I can't imagine that at all. But I do recall him telling me that he came home through typhoon. And when he got off the boat, he kissed the ground and swore he would never get on another boat until my mother convinced him to take him on a cruise. So there could be some nautical reference there.
I bet there's a nautical reference. And you're right, Tammy. It's usually the Navy that steals from the Army. So, but if anybody else has any ideas, if anybody else has any ideas, please do put it in the chat or let me know. Email me later if you'd like, and I'll pass it on to Tammy. Tammy, thank you so much for giving us this little brain teaser. And if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of share it in an email too, and let people work on it if they have an answer.
Yeah, I'd greatly appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you, Todd. And now we'd like to get over to Narce and Jack. Narce Caliva, you were a Army veteran, and Jack Keep, you were a Navy veteran. Now, each of you was born, 1928, 1929, respectfully. And I want to, before we sort of get into each of your individual services, since we both have you both on the same window, I thought that maybe you could paint us a picture of what society looked like at the point of when you were born, and what sort of led both of you to join the military. Jack, maybe you can start us off with that and just give us an idea of like what your early life was like. It's very different than what it is now.
Well, I was born in Rockaway Beach, New York. I was born between the ocean and the bay. And most of my early life, I was near the water. And we made a move to the North Shore of Long Island in 1941, in the spring of 1941. And of course, in December of that year, war was declared. And they built a shipyard down the street from us. And we would see the sailors very often walking up the street from their ships and going to town in the late afternoon. And I always had a desire to be a sailor from the time I was a little boy. And when I was in high school, I was planning, as soon as I got out of high school, to join the Navy. But when the war in Korea broke out in 1950, I was 16 years old at the time and was I was too young at that time, of course, to enlist. So as soon as I became 17 in 1951, I went and enlisted in the Navy. Those days were good days to live in, actually. They're very much different than the days we live in today. The whole atmosphere of the country was different. And there was a much greater spirit of patriotism because during World War II, everybody was involved. Whether you were a civilian or whether you were in the military, you were involved in some way in the war. Everything was rationed. You stood on lines. If you went down the street and saw a line in front of a store, you get on the end of the line, even though you didn't know what they were selling at the front. It might be a pound of butter, or it might be a pair of silk stockings or something like that. But everybody had to make sacrifices in those days. As boys, we would save scrap metal and newspapers. When our mothers used to save the grease from cooking and fill it in tin cans, and then we'd take it to the butcher shop, and we'd get, I think, 3 cents a pound for it. And they would use this in the war effort to draw the glycerin out of it for explosives. So everybody was involved in some way for the war effort. And that carried over into the 1950s. But the 1950s were a time when America was recovering. You could then buy automobiles, which you couldn't do before. You could buy appliances. You could buy so many things that you were not able to buy before. The young men who came home from the war were active in trying to grow their families and buy a home and buy an automobile and so on. So people were more interested in getting reestablished after so many years of poverty. Those of us who lived in those times were either were growing up in the Depression or we were born in the Depression. And following the 30s, we were in the 40s, which now you were in war and you still didn't have anything. So it was a time when people were becoming prosperous, and it was a good time to be living.
Narce, would you agree?
Yes, my experience was probably a little different, but yes, I agree with everything that he described.
How is your experience different?
Well, my beginnings perhaps are a little different because I'm a member of what you call the bridge generation. And to explain that, my father was born 123 years ago in 1900, and in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, then all of the big pineapple companies and so forth went to the Far East and recruited up to 30,000 Filipinos to come to Hawaii to work on remote locations in the islands on the plantations. So my father, exactly 100 years ago in 1923, took advantage of that, went to the Hawaiian Islands, taught himself to read, write, and speak English, and decided after working on the plantations for several years that he wanted to go to the United States, become a United States citizen, which meant that he would absolutely pledge allegiance to his new country and become assimilated and so forth. He did go to the United States, where he became a worker in the agricultural fields. He married the daughter of one of the wealthy farmers, orchardists, and so forth. And they were married in Tijuana, Mexico, because there were anti-miscegenation laws at that time. No so-called Orientals could marry Caucasians. But I was born the month before the Great Wall Street crash in 1929 in Salinas, California. Salinas is about 110 miles or so south of San Francisco, about 365 miles north of Los Angeles, in that area. So my first 3 or 4 years, I lived in a labor camp where my father was the boss of a crew of workers. And so all of the people that I knew were these Filipino young men who were, in a sense, became my many, many uncles. So after 3 or 4 years there, my father decided, for the sake of better education and so forth, we should move into the city where there were better schools. So he did. He moved into town, became a photographer. This was at the beginning of the Great Depression, the early 30s. So we lived the Depression years, at least that decade, in Salinas in an agricultural setting. He was a photographer. That was the time when the farm laborers and so forth were having uprisings to get better wages and better working conditions and so forth. But toward the end of that decade, my father decided to go into business, in a dry cleaning business with 2 others. And so they bought a business, a dry cleaning business, and it was going well for about the first year, but then we heard the announcement that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. The other 2 young men were drafted promptly. My father was kept on because my parents had been divorced by then. He was raising 3 children on his own as a single parent, and he was running what was considered an essential business. So during my high school years, it coincided directly with World War II. And during World War II, different groups created or had created for them service units. As you mentioned, the African-American women. During World War II, we also had a Japanese-American unit, and so on. In California, the 1st and 2nd Filipino regiments of the U.S. Army came to train, and they often came by our shop. I wished at that time that if I had been in service, that I would be a soldier and join one of those units. But I graduated from high school early when I was 16. I just kept on going to school in junior college there until I was 18, graduated with an associate's degree. And at that point, the selective service system kicked in. Everyone who turned 18 had to register, and you might be drafted. Well, of course, the armed forces were losing the members because of post-World War II, people going back to work and to take up their lives. And so they were drafting 19 to 25-year-olds. I waited for a few months, turned 19, and had to decide whether I would wait to be drafted, spend 2 years on active duty, and then 3 years in the reserves, or I could go ahead and volunteer for the regular service, regular Army, for 3 years and complete my obligation, which I decided to do. So I went to basic training at Fort Ord. And to make the longer story shorter, I got my school of choice after basic training, went back to Camp Lee, Virginia, became a personnel specialist with the idea of having chosen that school that I would be able to help put Army people in the correct jobs. So I reported to my first duty station as a trained personnel classification specialist, ready to help them put people in the right jobs, only to be told that they had waited 9 months for a school-trained specialist, and having not heard anything from the Department of the Army, had decided to go ahead and appoint somebody else. However, they asked me to stay on to help out if I would, while they reported me for another assignment. So I stayed on. And for a while, I learned all the personnel work I could there. Then they said I could earn my second stripe if I joined the military police and took care of their personnel business. So I became a corporal and was handling all the personnel affairs for the military police at Fort Eustis. That was also the training center for new second lieutenants who were training to be company grade officers. I saw so many of these officers come through there that I finally figured that I could probably do no worse a job than some of the ones that I saw. So I applied for OCS. I was 19 years old. I was selected, I think I was 20. They said I would be in the August class of 1950 at Fort Riley, Kansas. But first, on my way to Fort Riley, I had to go by Fort Knox to take some enlisted leadership training, which I did. And while I was there, the Korean War started, and there was speculation as to whether or not the OCS class would last the full 6 months, or whether they would cut it short and send whoever happened to be able to graduate as new second lieutenants over to Korea to be in the war. I did go to Fort Riley. I did last the 6 months. 200 of us started the course. The usual half didn't make it. I graduated number 50 in my class of a graduating group of 101. Of course, they ask you what branches in the Army you would prefer to be in. And you had to choose one combat branch. So I chose armor and quartermaster corps. And of course, they put me in the transportation corps. So they sent me back to Fort Eustis. I had been gone about 11 months. I checked in, saw all of my old friends, and got my assignment, which was to the Far East, which meant Korea, which is another story.
I'm going to bookmark right there, Narce, because I want to step back. There's 100 questions I could ask simply about that first portion of your service. But something I'm interested in, and thank you both for sort of painting that picture of your early years, is that you were both growing up through the World War II, and how that sort of helped shape you as a young man growing up in this country, and how you both sort of digested the news of World War II as it developed. Jack?
Well, in school, they always talked about the war. My schoolmates would talk about their fathers or their brothers or their uncles who were in the Army or whatever service they happened to be in. And I remember in one of the lower grades, one of our assignments was to make a scrapbook with war themes. Well, every magazine you got in your home in those days, for example, if it was an automobile company advertising in the magazine, you would see Jeeps and tanks and things like that. Always it showed servicemen somewhere, either in Europe or in the Far East. They would be enjoying themselves, or they would be fighting. They would be doing something having to do with the war, and you'd see some of the equipment. And so my mother helping me, we cut out all these pictures as time went by, pasted them in scrapbooks. So it gave us a good picture of what was going on, at least according to the magazines. And it made me very conscious of the war. But more than that, where were the young men? When you walked the streets of the town, you hardly ever saw anyone who was 18 or older, because most of those young men were in the military service, unless they were 4F or had some necessary civilian job. So people were conscious of that. And every home you passed that had young men who were in the service had one of those flags in the window that had stars on it indicating how many sons from that family were in the war, in the military service. And of course, if one of them was killed, there would be a gold star on the flag. So everybody was very conscious of it. And as I mentioned before, everything was rationed.
Mhm.
So life was about the war for everyone.
Narce, how did you take it on the West Coast?
One of the things that really impressed me that I remember to this day was that when I was in high school, we had an assembly one day, and there was a British commando who had come to our school to tell about his experiences and about fighting in World War II. He was there because there was a national war bond campaign going on, and that's why he was sort of making the rounds. That so impressed me that we had such people in the world that were trained to be skilled to act in wartime. I didn't really know that much about the armed forces, but I was quite aware that being a member of a minority group, and that in the Far East, the Japanese had occupied the Philippines, that was much on the mind of a lot of the people that I knew. And that awareness of what that situation was, that was in a sense sort of discriminatory, had never left me. And I know I'll probably be asked later about one of my assignments in Korea that was in a segregated unit. But of course, with me, discrimination began even before I was born, because brown men married to white women in the days that I grew up, even when the women were pregnant, had to walk in the streets when white people walked our town. And I remember as a boy selling newspapers and walking into the stores. This was just before the war, but many signs up there that there were no persons of this or that ethnic background were permitted to enter. And one that I'll never forget is the one that said, no Filipinos or dogs. And I remember that, but that was my awareness of the life that was going on during World War II.
Interesting. I imagine that there was such jubilation at the end of World War II. The world had come out of it. The United States was the victor. You know, there was everybody, like you said, they were coming back. They were getting their lives back in order. What was the feeling when the Korean War broke out? And what were did either of you really understand the general geography of where Japan was, who the North and South Koreans were, the Chinese, Vietnam? To me, it was very confusing even learning about that general region. What were your thoughts when that war broke out?
Because of my interest during World War II, those young men were our heroes in those days. We wanted to be like them. There was a patriotic spirit during World War II. We wanted to carry that on. We felt that those young men were serving our country and they were needed. And we wanted to do the same thing they did. The newspapers at the beginning of the war, most of the goings on in Korea were in the first few pages of the newspaper. But as time went on, it got farther and farther to the back of the newspaper, and people lost sight of it because most of them were getting reestablished from World War II. Many of the young men, many of my friends, some of them went into active service, but the others, instead of being drafted or volunteering, went into the reserves or the Naval Reserve or the National Guard, things like that, where they could still be at home, but felt that they were doing some sort of service.
And I would say that when I was 17 and 18, I was in junior college, and the student bodies at that time were a combination of recent high school graduates who knew nothing, and veterans who were returning from the war and studying under the GI Bill. And those veterans from World War II were mixed in their reactions as to how much they enjoyed or hated the service. So I really had no definite opinion at the time. All I knew was I had to fulfill my obligation when I entered it, which is one of the things that my father, as a new American citizen, had said, we expect that we will all do something for our new country. And so I entered the service with that idea that I would become a good soldier and go wherever and do whatever it took, even stronger in my resolve when I became an officer. So when I was assigned to Korea, and people often ask you, what do you know? What did you know? And my honest answer was almost nothing. I'd heard there was a war there, but other than the fact that I had a general interest in Asia because of the Philippines, and I had some weird sort of idea of what the geography was, which turned out to be wrong. But anyway, I went to Korea because it was my duty. I cannot claim to have been unusually patriotic, or because I wanted to help save the country, or that I was an idealist ready to fight communism, or whatever. I went because I was committed as a United States Army officer to go do my job, and if necessary, to give my life for my country. That's how I felt then. And that's the basis on which I went to serve.
Narce, can you describe for me your when you landed in Korea? What was it like?
When I landed in Korea,
Mhm.
It was a hot summer day, very humid. There was a peculiar odor in the air. The people that I saw, the Koreans, seemed, many of them, stricken, maybe even desperate as they approached us. There were a multitude of American troops everywhere. The military presence was pervasive. People were telling us what to do, where to go, and so forth, and they were hurrying us to our destinations. And that was my initial reaction. When I got off, we had been sent over from Japan. We'd gone from the train. I'd gone overseas on a troop ship. We processed in Japan, went down to Sasebo on a train, and then we took a ferry boat overnight, and then we landed that morning in Busan.
And what date was that you landed?
That was the end of July 1951.
Jack, did you ever set foot in country? I know that you were on the USS Gatling, correct?
I was on the Gatling, yes, in the Gatling. I did not set foot on Korean soil during the Korean War, but I've been there 3 times since.
Yeah.
I saw many pictures of the devastation. Of course, we were all aware of what how badly Korea was being destroyed, even though they had kind of a rather ancient civilization there. Their homes and all were very old. But I did see the pictures of it. And when I returned, I immediately recognized what a different country that was than the one that we were helping to save in those days.
Can you talk about life on the USS Gatling? What was your job?
Well, the Gatling was my home. And we spent most of our time at sea in very confined spaces because the destroyer, it was a Fletcher class destroyer, was 39 feet 6 inches wide and 375 feet long.
Narce, sorry, Jack, can I interrupt real quick? Because I flagged this as I read an interview with you, and I was like, does every sailor know? Every sailor seems to remember the exact measurement of their ship, and why is that?
I don't know. I know the beam because I asked the chief petty officer one day, how wide is this ship? And he told me 39 feet 6 inches. I've never forgotten it since then. But if a ship is your home, you want to learn how big it is, how long it is, how it's equipped, what the spaces are that and what they're used for. And most of the space in the ship has to do with operating the ship or doing warfare. So there's not much left for living space. And the living space is very cramped. You are probably 15 or 18 inches from the next person when you're sleeping in your bunk. And everything you own goes in a small locker underneath the bunks. So it's pretty compact living.
And what was and sorry I interrupted before, but what was your job on the ship?
I was actually a bosun mate. I mentioned that I spent 6 months on the bridge. There was a point at which I thought that I was not going to go for third class, get chosen for third class. So I decided to change my rating and I went up on the bridge. My interest really was in seamanship as a sailor. So I loved the work on deck. I loved to work with the boats and the rigging. And when I went to the bridge now, I was learning signaling and navigation. And so it rounded out my understanding of how ships operate.
And the ship's mission. This is back when we had destroyers. What sort of, I guess as a civilian, I don't know quite how to ask the question because I don't understand maybe the military terminology of what was the mission of this ship during the Korean War?
The mission of destroyers was both air defense, surface defense, and undersea defense. Defense or attacks. We did anti-submarine warfare. We fired ship to shore, ship to ship, ship to air, anti-aircraft. My responsibility in general quarters was to direct 40 millimeter anti-aircraft guns.
And did you have to ever set them off? Did you ever have to use them?
Thankfully, we never had to use them. We owned the air and we owned the sea. Our work in Korea was with Task Force 77, which was the fast carrier group. And our responsibilities at that time would be when we were on station, we were behind the carrier, about 1,000 yards behind the carrier when the planes were taking off and landing. That was in case a pilot went into the drink, and we would do search and rescue for him. And when we were not on station with the carrier, we were on the screen, which was a circle of destroyers around the whole the convoy that we were in. So we had varied duties. Some of the more exciting aspects of it were at night when we had darkened ship, and you have all these ships out there. You might have 50, 60 or more ships out there in this convoy. And when it came time to launch planes, you had to change course into the wind. And all those ships had to be very precise in making their turns. And a number of cases, ships got run over by larger ships by making mistakes in the turns. The exciting thing to watch was when the planes were landing, the pilots were coming in, and as they approached, the only lights that went on in the whole convoy was the officer who was directing the plane with those little wigwag paddles. His lights would go on, and the plane would come, and as soon as it caught the arresting hook, the lights would go off again. So it was rather an exciting thing to watch those planes and the skill the pilots had in taking off and landing.
That had to be a sight coming from, East Coast of the United States, and then on a ship in the middle of the Korean War, and, suddenly a man of the world in a way.
The first 2 years of my service was in the Atlantic Ocean. In 1953, spring 1953, we went to Korea, went through the Panama Canal. From there, we went to Hawaii, and from Hawaii to Midway, from Midway to Japan, and from Japan to Korea. And we would spend 30 or 35 days out at sea off the coast of Korea, doing whatever our duties happened to be, whether it was shore bombardment or with Task Force 77. And then we'd go back to Japan for a few days to replenish, go back out to sea again for another 30 or 35 days. And that's the routine that we had while we were there. But for the East Coast tin cans, that's you're probably aware that that's the name we give to the destroyers. For the East Coast tin cans, most of them went on a worldwide cruise. We circumnavigated the globe. We went through the Panama Canal going over, came back through the Suez Canal and then across the Atlantic Ocean. So we circumnavigated the globe, we crossed the international date line, we crossed the equator, had the initiation by Neptunus Rex and his crew, and visit a lot of ports of call.
Very cool.
I think by the time I'd served 4 years in the Navy, I'd visited 25 countries.
Cliff asked here in the chat, Jack, did North Korea have any submarines during the war?
Did I serve in any?
No, did North Korea have any submarines during the war?
If they had them, they weren't using them.
Narce, I want to jump back over to you. You were in country. You were part of supplying the soldiers who were fighting on the front. Was it the time that you were working in that supply chain that you were part of the segregated unit?
Say again.
When at what point during your time in Korea were you working with the segregated unit, and what was your job?
Oh, when I got to Korea, I was sent up to the transportation center for Korea to get my assignment. And the question I was asked was, would I mind serving in a colored unit, a colored truck unit? That surprised me a little bit, but I said absolutely not. I'd welcome the opportunity. After all, I thought back, I'd grown up on the wrong side of the track, so to speak. All of my friends growing up in elementary school were of mixed races and colors. And then I thought about maybe having wanted to be in the 1st or 2nd Filipino Regiment. And so when that question hit me, I had an immediate reaction. And I said, I'd be glad to go. I think that rather surprised him. But I went over there and I went to a unit and I didn't know what to expect because I'd heard a lot of stories about, quote, colored truck units and blacks and so forth. And I found, as a new officer in that company, I was very pleasantly surprised. I found that the men in that unit were really not very much different from the ones I'd been in other units in the Army. And I was particularly impressed favorably with the quality of the leadership of the non-commissioned corps. I had an excellent platoon sergeant, first sergeant, and I could see that in that community, just as in many others I'd been before that, there were many kinds of people with different levels of skill and leadership and so forth. And that's what I discovered, and I was pleasantly surprised. We concentrated on the mission, which was to deliver supplies to the forward units, because where I was with this separate company in the Wanjoo area, which was the end of the rail line, we went to pick up fuel to deliver up there. And our unit was absolutely committed to serving and supporting those units who were up on the line. I could not have any greater respect for those guys who had to do the fighting every day. And it was an honor to support them.
And Wanjoo was a little south of, I probably mispronounced it as Daejeon.
I was a little, where it says Jeongdo, just below Seoul, about where it says Do, D-O, and the end of that was Wanjoo. And that was the end of the rail line. So I was up there for about 3 or 4 months. But in the meantime, in 1949, the United States had signed the Geneva Conventions, like so many other countries. One of the provisions of which was that if there were prisoners of war taken, that the detaining power had to investigate any incidents that might involve mistreatment or alleged mistreatment. So although I was in this unit for the segregated unit, by December of that year, I'd been promoted to first lieutenant and transferred to one of the first desegregated units. And all that meant for us, in a sense, was to take half of a white company and mix it with half of a black company. So we did not have many of the problems, I think, that took place in other places in Korea or in other places in the service, where maybe you take a few blacks or a few minorities and mix them in with a greater population, and they have a much more difficult time of being accepted or, feeling a part of it. We did not have that because we were so concentrated on accomplishment of the mission. And besides that, they could have the companionship of their fellow blacks or whites. So I was up there through the winter, and in the spring, they transferred my unit and me down to Busan, where they took me aside and sent me on a TDY special assignment to Kojido, which was the United Nations prisoner of war camp. And where we had prisoners, the International Committee of the Red Cross had come in and reported that there had been some incidents, and these needed investigating, or at least review. So I was put on a panel of 17 officers sent over to Kojido to look into these cases, which we did, finding that there was no fault on the part of the United Nations forces. But that particular assignment, an incident, left with me forever the feelings of how I wanted to spend probably the rest of my life. Because I saw the International Committee of the Red Cross workers in action. I never saw such a group of intelligent, objective, fair persons. I'd never met such a group. And they lived the values of the International Red Cross movement, Red Crescent movement, which was humanity, impartiality, and neutrality. When I finished that assignment, I went back to Busan, spent my last year in Busan. When I came back to the States, finished my school, graduated from grad school. I went to work for a couple of international companies. And then I decided to join the American Red Cross, knowing that I would never get rich. Nobody ever does, I think. But that it would be furthering my interests in the military, in travel, in helping people with their problems and so forth. I didn't know how long I'd stay, but I did stay 30 years as a paid staff member, and I've been a volunteer Red Cross person ever since.
When you came back, did you talk about your experiences in Korea? Start with Jack. It may have frozen.
Oh, I think they froze.
All right, we'll wait a second to see if they catch up to us here. And if not, we will, I'm sure, catch them. If they drop off, we'll bring them back into the room. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead and do the station break there, Sean.
Yeah, I figure that's a good time for a station break, I guess. We are the VBC. We've been around since 2008. Our mission is creating communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. It looks like they're rejoining us now.
Oh, you know what? I put them in the waiting room. I'll bring them back.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see if it works. But for those of you joining us for the first time, again, this is Todd DiPestino, our executive director. He started the VBC back in 2008. And my name is Sean Hall, I'm the director of programming. I joined the VBC about 3.25 years ago. And we have a free magazine again. If you don't get it, it's because we don't have your address. Make sure you email us your address. We'll be sure to put in a free magazine for you into the mail. And Todd also put into the chat here, if you check it out, the link to our survey. We'd love for you to take this survey. It takes 2.5 minutes. Just lets us know what you think of the program, how we could do better. We watch these very closely so that we know how to continue to bring you quality programs week in and week out. Todd, go ahead.
Yeah, I just asked Narce and Jack are back. I asked them to unmute. And,
Okay.
Hey, Narce, how are you?
Okay.
We lost you there for a second.
Yeah.
But if you wouldn't mind, I just want to go back quickly to one thing that you said, just to emphasize it for our audience and for me as a historian. When I would teach American history, I would teach that the armed forces was desegregated on July 26, 1948, when Harry S. Truman signed that executive order 9981. But here you are in Korea, long after 1948, dealing with a segregated army. So it took a long time, I guess, for that segregation to actually happen, huh?
Yes, it took the Army a while to get around to all of its units. And of course, we were in the war had started. And so by the time they got around to us, then that's what happened. It just took time.
Okay, got it.
And the question we asked before the screen froze here, Jack, was, did you talk about the Korean War whenever you came home?
No one seemed to be interested. Someone wrote a book on the Korean War. The title of it was, "Hey Mac, where you been?" And that's pretty much the attitude of people. They knew you weren't in town. They hadn't seen you in a while. They didn't know where you were. They didn't know what you were doing. And my eldest daughter asked me a few years ago, "Dad," she said, "how come you never talked about your service in the Navy and in Korea?" I said, "Nobody ever asked and nobody ever listened when I talked about it." But in recent years, since we have developed the Korean War Veterans Association, we have kind of banded together and been able to share our experiences. And the Korean people, now that their land is developed, they're wonderful people. They've brought me back to Korea 3 different times. They're always having special events for us. You can't meet the Korean people without them wanting to give you something. And every Korean you meet virtually will say, "Because of you, I'm here today." So we do get more questions now than we ever got before.
Narce, did you talk about your experiences in Korea when you came home?
No, I came home on a troop ship, landed in Seattle, went out to the airport, flew home to San Francisco. My father picked me up. We went home. Nobody ever asked me a question. It didn't seem like anybody cared. If they did, they kind of wondered where I'd been, but that was it. I went on home on leave, and then I went on to finish my service. So I was not really I was still in service for a few more months. So I was not in you might say, in a situation where people would be asking me.
Do you think part of the reason that, they say the forgotten war is maybe the coverage of it during at that time? Like we mentioned earlier, how did you digest World War II news? It was in high school, it was all around you, it was on assignments. How was the Korean War being brought to the American public during that time?
I'm not quite sure whether, are you talking about now?
Well, while you were there, how was the news of the developments of the Korean War relayed to the American people during that time? And was it just not as thorough as World War II, which sort of helped to bring about the forgotten war? You got back and no one really knew where you'd been.
Well, I think during the war, people were aware of it at first, and unless you had somebody in your family who was in the war, you'd see a young man in uniform, and you'd know that he was in the service. But no one ever asked you what you were doing, where you were, and whether you'd gone to Korea. They just recognized that you were in the military. There was a general disinterest in what was going on after the first year or so.
That very true. Ira, Martin, you just put that in the chat. That's something that I learned on July 27th at our event at the Heinz History Center to commemorate the end of the Korean War. The Korean War was called the Forgotten War while the war was going on. In 1951, there was a sense that people lost interest. When the war became a stalemate along the 38th parallel, people stopped paying attention.
Was it just war overload? That World War II, everybody was tapped out after that. And from that point on, because interest picked up again as news picked up again during Vietnam, but during the Korean War era, there, I think people were ready to move on from war and the whole, dealing with that.
That's pretty much what the case was.
Yeah, and when I got out of the service, I went back to school immediately, and students in college for those 3 years, they were interested in their own futures. They were not really thinking about what had just happened or what was in the past.
Brad Washbaugh asked in the chat, was there a draft during the Korean War?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Big
I
time.
think so.
Yes. Yeah.
Big time.
Yeah. You mentioned it was called the Forgotten War. In recent years, the Koreans have kind of led the way this way, but it's become known now as the Forgotten Victory. When you see what has developed in Korea, you can see that it was a forgotten victory.
And here it is. There it is in yellow, blue, and green. Is it not? I mean, look at this map. You could just see the infrastructure in the south, from 10,000 miles away. You're looking down 10,000 feet down, 30,000 feet view, whatever it is, down at the Korean Peninsula. And north of that DMZ, you see there's nothing there, very little there. South, there are all kinds of roads. And that's just, you could see the same picture at night with the south being all lit up, the north being in darkness. Forgotten victory, I think, is a good term for it.
The only lights you see on that satellite picture in North Korea is around Pyongyang, which is, their capital.
Jack, I was going to ask you, you started to go down that road. You've been back to Korea multiple times since. And what is your experience going back? And how has your perception of Korea changed since your time in the Navy?
I've really gotten to have a love of the Korean people. Whether you're in Korea visiting or whether you're here in this country, we have a large Korean population around the Washington area here. And so the embassy takes great interest in us. Whenever they have one of their dignitaries come from Korea, they want a group of Korean War veterans to be there at our memorial, to be there at their embassy. And they treat us wonderfully. Not only the people who are in the Korean embassy or their military, but the people themselves are very cordial, very, very loving and friendly.
Narce, same question.
We have a Korean lady who is kind of a mascot to our chapter of the Korean War Veterans Association. She's an associate member and she comes to most of our meetings.
Right.
Narce, the same question to you. How has your perception changed from your time in the Army and in the Korean War until now?
I went back to Korea 20 years after I left, when I was with the Red Cross in the Far East. And at that time, about 1969, 70, 71, mainly 71, I was the supervisor in charge of the Red Cross offices in Korea, the offices with the troops. And I didn't recognize the country that I had seen before, because mainly before it was just rubble. And I had never been to Seoul, but when I went back for that time, I visited all of the major commands and so forth, and the installations, and I saw that they really had built it up. And then, like Jack, I have been back more recently, 2018, I was invited with a group of veterans by the president of Korea to attend their 70th anniversary of the establishment of their armed forces. And so many of us have been back that have belonged to this association, and we've seen firsthand and know that it's almost miraculous, the rise from the rubble of South Korea.
I think South Korea has changed more than any country on earth in the past 50 years. It's
Would be.
thank you, Ira Martin, for sharing this wonderful issue from October 5, 1951, U.S. News and World Report, Korea, the Forgotten War. Casualties rise, no end to conflict in sight. It's an argument about, or it's an article about what's going on in the Korean War and how people aren't really paying much attention. And maybe the military, it suggests, is using Korea as kind of a testing ground for larger future wars that may come down the road. Thank you so much, Ira.
If I may interject there, the Korean War was one of the bloodiest wars that the United States has ever been involved in. Today, we lose, number of people in the military due to being killed or injured in action, wounded, and so forth. But if you think back about the Korean War, we lost an average of 1,000 killed in action every month for 36 months.
Wow.
That's 1,000 a month.
Mm-hmm.
And if that happened today, you could see that there'd be quite an
uproar
reaction.
Wow. I mean, and here, let me share these statistics. And it's not only the service members, U.S. service members who are being killed and wounded in Korea. It's also the Koreans themselves. 5 million people, military and civilian, killed in the Korean War.
Yeah.
5 million. This is a country of what, 20 million. Just astounding.
Decimated. Comes to mind. You both mentioned the Korean War Veterans Association. I was wondering if you could give us a little history of the association, what its mission is. Jack?
Oh, I didn't hear the question.
Sorry, could you give us a bit of a history of the Korean War Veterans Association and what its mission is?
Oh, okay. What year did the start?
Well, the latest charter was 2008. 2008 was the latest congressional charter. But in 2008, our local.
When did the association start?
Well, before that, but I don't know the exact date.
Yeah.
But there originally were over 300 chapters. We are number 313 here, headquartered in Winchester. And we were one that was organized toward the end. So since we received our charter in 2008, and Jack was one of the 31 charter members at the time, as I recall. I didn't come in until about 3 years later. But since that time, the numbers of veterans, of course, has dwindled. And we now have about only 150 or so active chapters. Our chapter here is the third most active in terms of having active members. And we used to have a little over 100 members. We now currently still have 88. We continue to lose members, but we continue to recruit new ones, but we lose more than we recruit.
Greg Yost, you had a fairly extensive question here, but I unmuted you so you could pipe in and ask.
Sure. I wondered if during the war, you and your comrades paid any attention to the news or the talk coming out of all the big shots in the world. The firing of MacArthur when Eisenhower ran in 1952, he said, "I will go to Korea and see what's going on there." There was the Red Scare that said this was all a big communist plot. Did you pay any attention to that? Do you think those people had any idea what they were doing, what they were talking about, or was it just a bunch of BS to you for the war that you were fighting?
From the Navy point of view, we didn't have newspapers. Of course, we didn't have television either. You couldn't get anything on radio when you're way out at sea anyway. But we did have this teletype, and they would give us, each day they would put out the plan of the day. It'd be pasted on one of the bulkheads where you go down to the mess deck. And it would just give you a little summary of some of the things that were happening in the day. So we got very little news while we were at sea. Of course, when you're ashore or somewhere in the United States at a base, you might get more news there. But we got very little news of what was going on.
And for me, the only news that I got mainly was from Stars and Stripes.
What type of news would you receive from Stars and Stripes?
But whatever they printed in Stars and Stripes, that's about all I heard or learned about while I was in Korea.
They would tell us of some of the big actions
Yeah.
in the war, but it was just a summary.
Yeah.
Seeing as how the Korean War ended in armistice, over the last 70 years, has there been any point where you followed the news and thought it's about to go all out again, or it's about to pop off again? You know, did you ever get that feeling like the Korean Peninsula could get hot on one more time?
I may have had that feeling, but I don't think anybody's stupid enough to start another war, given all of the new armaments and so forth that could destroy us all. If there was a major armed conflict again. And the situation now is quite different. We went over there as a police action representing, a fight against aggression, but the politics and so forth these days and the negotiations between the governments have made that that kind of approach impossible, to the extent that I think that America must remain strong and ready to deter any aggression that we think that we should. But then the way some of our policies change these days, I'm not sure.
Jack, you remember that? Go ahead.
I'm
Todd?
sorry, Narce and Jack, I have a question too, kind of a little bit of a technical question about the Korean War Veterans Association. It seems to me that there are kind of three categories of Korean veterans. There's the Korean veteran who served in country between 1950 and 1953. There's the Korean War veteran who served elsewhere in the world between 1950 and 1953.
Right.
And then there's the defender of Korea, somebody who has served in Korea since the armistice in 1953. Is that an accurate way to?
That would probably be more from, I think, 1955
Yes.
to the present time would be Korea defense veterans. Then the other middle group there that you mentioned would be Korea era veterans. And they would not, to my knowledge, be eligible to join the Korean War Veterans Association.
Except as associates.
Yes, Narce remind me, as associates. But the Korea defense veterans are eligible to become part of the Korean War Veterans Association.
Anybody who
Some years ago, there was a limitation on the percentage of defense veterans that you could have in the chapter. But
Got it.
that's pretty much gone now.
Okay, that's been lifted. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, there's a question about, there rose a question about whether we were going to become a last man standing organization or a legacy organization. And we chose unofficially, I guess, the legacy path.
You know, I'm looking at our Zoom room and I see quite a few of your Narce, of your Red Cross colleagues there. Ava Martin and Sam Christie and Doris Heaton. And I'm sure there are others that I'm missing. Edith Clark there. I saw her wave her hand. Connie, Betsy. Hello, Betsy. How are you? If anybody wants to chime in and give us, you know, dish some dirt, Ed Fender, give some dirt here on Narce, kind of the stuff that, you know, he's not talking about. Just kidding. Janet, you know, feel free to raise your hand or wave your hand. And, oh, here we go. Okay, Marie, there we go. Or Marilee, you could unmute.
Yes, I was in Korea in 1963 with Red Cross. I was a donut dolly.
Wow. What
So
was it
it's a-
like? What was
a
it like
whole
in 63?
It was a whole nother world. And, you know, they still had the little hooches with the rice on the top. And it was an incredible experience. And I went back, I was a therapist, and I went back 50 years later. And it was another world. You could use your hand to open the door to your apartment. It was incredible. But to be there in those times was amazing. This was a time when, you know, the service was important, and we felt that was a gift to be able to do that. I served for 15 months in Korea.
Isn't that amazing? What a memorable experience that must have been.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And like the others, I didn't talk about it, you know, particularly because we were donut dollies. So how do you tell people you were a donut dolly in Korea?
Yeah, exactly. How do you even begin to make sense of that for other people? Larry Guggens, Air Force, F4 pilot and weapons officer. You served in Korea. That makes you a defender of Korea. What was Korea like in the 1980s? I guess it was building up, but not quite, not near where it is today.
Yeah, exactly. It was. I was stationed at the Osan Air Base in south of Seoul, and flew A-10s out of Suwon, if anybody's familiar with that. I think. But anyway, yeah, it was still rural, quite rural. Did some traveling around when we could. I just got to emphasize how. I mean, I said it already multiple times how great the Korean people are. Just outstanding. We could learn a lot from them. But anyway, it was still quite rural, but it was developing quickly. I can tell you that I had a Hyundai and swore I'd never, ever buy a Hyundai again because it was a piece of crap. Now they're an elite car. So that's how much has changed since 1985 to the present time. But I thoroughly enjoyed it.
I didn't know Hyundais existed 40 years ago. Ava?
Yeah, two things. Well, first thing, I first knew Narce in 1972 on the West Coast, so early in my Red Cross career. But I was honored to have two different assignments in Korea, one up at Camp Casey, which also covered up to the DMZ and that whole Western corridor. And then the second time I was in Korea, I was honored because it was the 50th anniversary of the signing of the armistice. And to go to the celebration at we had buses as far as you could see from all these Korean veterans that had come for the honor, and it was just from all different countries and stuff. It was a wonderful time to be there and see the veterans that had come back came back to Korea. That's always one of the important things in memory of in part of my Red Cross career. So.
Did you get a sense of danger at all in Korea the first time you went, which I'm guessing was maybe in the 70s?
No, actually, it was in the 90s.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
you know, I think there's always never knowing what the North Koreans are going to do. I think that there was always a little bit of sense of what was going to happen. I think it was more for relatives or people being home than you were there. You just kind of did your job. But I had, relatives that would write me or whatever and were that were concerned about, what was going on. So I think there's still always a little sense of what's going to happen, even for our troops that are in Red Cross people that are still in Korea.
Yes, apprehension always. This is, I've got a, wow. Okay, Betsy, you put something big in the chat here, but I want to go to Carol and William Wagoner. Where did the donuts come from? Were they made locally or what, Mary Lee?
The donuts were made by Korean bakers in our office in the Quonset hut on base. And I was at with the Army hospital in ASCOM, and then up on the DMZ at Camp Pelham.
Betsy Tanner, what a wonderful tribute you put here in the chat. And I'm just going to read it off. I think this will be a good way to end the program. Narce and Leslie Correa, Presidential Citation 2019, The Dynamic Duo. On April 12th, 2019, the American Red Cross Lifetime Achievement Award was presented to Narce Caliva in recognition of and with heartfelt gratitude for your 60 years of compassionate service and dedicated commitment to living and fulfilling the American Red Cross mission, vision, values, and fundamental principles, both domestically and internationally. Likewise, the same award was presented to Leslie Caliva for your 50 years of service and commitment. Narce is active in the Korean War Veterans Association, serving as the director since 2016 and as the current bylaws committee chairman. Leslie currently is the Winchester, Virginia community volunteer leader of the Red Cross. Wonderful tribute, Betsy. Thank you very much for filling in that list of honors. Narce, what a career, what a life you've had.
And we just barely scratched the surface. Narce, please.
Right. I've enjoyed it all.
I've enjoyed it all. Well, we've enjoyed having you, Narce and Jack Keep. Thank you so much for sharing just a little bit of your story with us tonight. This is what we're all about, especially focusing on forgotten warriors of forgotten wars like Korea. So thank you for joining us. We'd love to have more Korean War veterans join us sometime. Next week, we're doing open conversation. I just recruited somebody for that. In the chat while we were talking this evening, you'll be fascinated by her and her story and where she is. And she will be joining us a week from tomorrow. So I hope you join us then. Before then, I'm giving a lecture on Thursday night at 7 p.m. on the history and culture of Vietnam. It's going to be more of a conversation and a lecture. I hope you do join us if you're interested in the history of that fascinating country. All right, Sean, any last words?
No, thank you all for being with us this evening. Looking forward to more VBC as we continue on with this just really an incredible year of amazing programming. Thank you all for always being a part of it. And thank you all for joining us. If you're new to us, always a pleasure. You're welcome back anytime. Thank you all and have a great week.
Happy Labor Day.